Welcome to the final webinar of our Spring 2022 Global Economic Governance Book Talk series, hosted by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Bill Kring. I'm the Executive Director of the GDP Center, and I'm pleased to welcome Kathryn Hochstetler today. Global climate solutions depend on a low carbon energy transitions in developing countries, but little is known about how these will unfold. Examining the transitions of Brazil and South Africa, Kathy reveals in her new book, Political Economies of Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil and South Africa, how choices about wind and solar power respond to four different constellations of interests and institutions, or four simultaneous political economies of energy transition. The political economy of climate change set Brazil and South Africa on different tracks, with South Africa's coal-based electricity system fighting against an existential threat. Since deforestation dominates Brazil's climate emissions, climate concerns were secondary there for electricity planning. Both saw significant mobilization around industrial policy and cost and consumption issues, showing the importance of economic considerations for electricity choices in emerging economies. Host communities resisted Brazilian wind power, but accepted other forms. And Kathy argues that national energy transition finally depends on the intersection of these political economies, with South Africa illustrating a politicized transition mode and Brazil presenting a bureaucracy-dominant one. Kathryn Hochstetler is professor and head of the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has been researching and publishing on environmental politics in South America for 3 decades. Her work includes studies of social movements, environmental policy, trade agreements like Mercosur, developmental finance, and participation in international environmental negotiations. Before turning it over to Kathy, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording will be immediately accessible after. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions, and give your name and affiliation so that I can give you credit for your question. We will take questions after Kathy's remarks, but feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion when they come to mind. Thank you, and with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kathy.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and it's nice to be with everyone today. I see people telling us their locations, and I am in London, which means that it is in the afternoon here. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so I guess we're all coming in from all kinds of different times. And I'm very happy to be here and to have this opportunity to present my work to the Global Development Policy Center and to people who are joining us online. So without further ado, since I was only given about 25 or 30 minutes to do my talk, I will launch right into it. It's a complicated book and there's a lot to be said. So let's see if I can share my screen and let you hear more about what the book is all about. So I am talking today about this book that was published by Cambridge University Press last year, Political Economies of Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil and South Africa. And what I'm doing in this book is trying to bring a comparative political economy approach to energy transition. And here on the left, you see what's the dependent variable, if you will, of my book, which is this question of, well, how much of these different kinds of electricity are being produced in Brazil and South Africa, what's being built in those energy infrastructures, and how do we understand why that happens? And you can see here from this initial chart in the book that there's really pretty dramatically different kinds of results going on. So Brazilian wind power is the line that is rising quickly, although it's flat at the beginning, but it rises quickly and it rises by far and away the highest, almost 18 gigawatts of electricity in built capacity and wind power. But then Brazilian solar power is that dark red line, and it's really one of the latest to start and continues to not have progressed very far by the time my book ends, which is really 2018, 2019. And then in contrast, South African wind and solar power start quite well and begin looking much like the Brazilian case but then after just a couple of years, start really to stalemate and stagnate, and the energy transition to wind and solar power in South Africa really gets stalled. And so my book is about trying to understand through this comparative political economy lens why it is that we have these really dramatically different results when in the climate debate, for example, we hear, oh, there must be this energy transition, more renewable energy, when it seems so obvious as a solution. Why would we have such different kinds of outcomes? And what I'm arguing in this book is that energy transition is really another political economy transition. So it's not unlike the market transitions that we studied in the 1980s and 1990s, the rise of neoliberal approaches and the like, and that many of the same tools and approaches that we use to understand that economic transition can also be used to understand the energy transition. And when I say it's a political economy transition, I mean a couple of things by that. One of them is that it responds to a basic structure of political and economic interests. But even though that basic structure is there, it doesn't determine the outcomes alone, because on top of those interests and out of existing institutions and power relations, then different state society coalitions get built that actually end up looking really quite different in the two countries, even though they're responding to some of the same basic structure of political and economic interests. And the political economies, the multiple political economies, reflects this argument in the book that there are at least 4 quite important arenas where you need to have transitions taking place in order to have a larger energy transition. And that there are these 4 political economies of energy transition that actually have quite different interest structures when you go and look at that particular policy arena. So in the first political economy of climate change, well, we have a diffuse collective interest in climate action. That's true for everyone in society, but it's a political economy that brings real concentrated costs for fossil fuel industries. In industrial policy, in contrast, much of what we're talking about are concentrated benefits. So firms that build wind and solar power and operate it have some real economic opportunities that can be supported by governmental industrial policies. And then there's some possible diffuse economic benefits for the whole country in terms of innovation policy and jobs and things like that. And then there's the very different third political economy, which is the political economy of distribution and consumption. So at least historically, wind and solar power cost more, and those higher costs were then spread across national consumers. But if you were somebody without electricity, wind and solar, and especially solar power, might bring you electricity where you didn't have it before. So there's a possible concentrated benefit for that group, and then concentrated costs for particularly heavy consumers of electricity. And then the fourth political economy reflects the fact that wind and solar power are infrastructure. They're built infrastructure, and they must be placed in particular locations. And those locations already have a given environment, a given local economy, a given set of people who live there. And there's some theoretical dispute then about whether wind and solar power bring costs to those local communities or bring benefits to those local communities. So that's the basic interest structure of these 4 political economies. But again, remember, I said my approach says we don't stop with the basic interest structure. We go on and we say, well, how are multiple coalitions then built that are for and against reform? And so with climate change, we're really asking the question about state capacity. Do states have the capacity to identify long-term national interests and work towards them, even when very powerful actors in society might be benefiting from the status quo, like fossil fuel producers and the like? And I put this political economy first because I think it's really in many ways one of the most important political economies for this issue, because it's the one political economy where it's very clear that if you are making progress on energy transition for climate purposes, that you also will have a group of clear losers, that your actors in society that are committed to fossil fuels and to the existing ways of production and things like that are actors who will have to stop doing some of the things that they're stopping. So the climate change political economy is a potentially zero-sum political economy. And it involves the need to impose costs on powerful actors. But then you have the other three political economies, and I'm showing them here as a group because in many ways, these political economies are ones that can really bring benefits. And so they can counteract some of the costs of climate action by supporting new industries and generating new jobs and new kinds of innovation. So there's a real possibility then, and I look at the industrial policy literature to help me understand what states can do to support the development of new industries and what are some of the ways in which those need to be managed for the broader positive economic outcomes. And then there's the question of distribution and consumption, which is a service provision question of whether wind and solar power provide high quality options at reasonable cost, now from the perspective of consumers rather than producers. And then there's a final political economy that's really a political economy of community mobilization issues, which is this one that looks at how do local communities in Brazil and South Africa experience having these new infrastructure projects brought into their local communities. But then there's one final step of my analysis, which is this one that says, well, once you look at each of these dynamics, how do they fit together? Do they perhaps reinforce each other so that you have a climate change policy that's supported by industrial policy, supported by your consumption interests? Do they work together, or might you have climate change dynamics that are undercut by industrial policy that promotes fossil fuels, for example? Many countries have that kind of combination. And so there's the need to look at how they interact. And it's especially important because in each of these political economies, you have different state actors and you have different societal actors, depending on the lens that's being brought to climate to energy transition. So the climate change political economy, for example, involves many times ministries of environment, sometimes ministries of foreign affairs. It involves climate activists, involves the fossil fuel industry. But then when you get to industrial policy, I mean, the Ministry of Environment says very little about industrial policy. There you're with ministries of energy and ministries of economy and innovation agencies, and you're with the firms or whoever it is that's actually building the wind and solar power and building the components that go into them. So each of these political economies involves quite a different set of actors with quite a different set of interests and a different set of institutions. And so it's really quite important to take this final step of saying, how do they all fit together? Is it a reinforcing story where all of the political economies are working towards a similar outcome, lots of wind power? Or is it a political economy or an overall political economy of energy transition where some of the components are pushing for change in energy transition, but others of the political arenas are pulling against it and pushing for the status quo? So it's a fairly complicated analytical structure. And the way that the book works, the basic methodology of the book is to take that beginning set of outcomes, lots of wind power in Brazil, not so much solar power, the difficult outcomes for South Africa, and looking at each of these dynamics and saying, does the dynamic of climate change, the actors and institutions and the way they interact, the coalitions that are built, do those help us understand the issue? And just for example, in the Brazilian case, there's no good climate reason to build lots of wind power and no solar power. When you're in a tropical, sunny country like Brazil, you should have a lot of solar power if you're really going to be addressing climate change. And so the difference between wind and solar power then must come from one or more of the other political economies. And in fact, it's the industrial policy and the distribution and consumption political economies that end up being really quite instrumental for that Brazilian case. But that's the methodology, to look at the dynamic and the actors and their interactions, and to think about how well they help us account for the outcomes that we know. So as I said, when I was introducing the political economies, the really crucial one, the starting point, is, I think, the climate change political economy. This question about whether states have the capacity to identify long-term national interests and work towards them, even over the interests of powerful actors. And this is a place where my two cases are actually very different, because in the South African case, when you look at its greenhouse gas emissions by sector, that top line is the energy sector. And what you can see from this chart on the left is that if South Africa is going to address climate change, it really has to undergo an energy transition, given that almost all of its greenhouse gases, and half of them are in the electricity sector, but given that almost all of its greenhouse gases are from energy, it must change its energy sector to address climate. And then in contrast, in the Brazilian case on the right there, almost all of Brazil's historic greenhouse gas emissions, this time the top line there again, green, come from deforestation and land use change, from the process of changing the use of land from forests to agriculture, to other kinds of development, to roads. But deforestation generally is what has historically driven Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that Brazil for a while made big improvements actually in its greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation, but energy has never been a particularly large part of Brazil's greenhouse gas emissions, even though it is a growing part. And that then gives us our first interesting contrast between the two countries, where we end up with really different patterns from the very beginning in South Africa and Brazil. So in South Africa, what we have coalitions that are fighting very directly over climate. It's not the only thing they fight about, but they very much are fighting over climate. And you can think of the South African case as one that has a pro-status quo coalition, and one that is a coalition in favor of a transition to more wind and solar power. And as I say here, the pro-status quo coalition really has the structural power, in the sense that it reflects the historic political economy of South Africa, often referred to as the mineral energies complex. It has Eskom, the big state-owned utility there, at the heart of it, which has historically produced all of South Africa's electricity. There were industrial allies, and I've put them in brackets because they changed positions a bit over the years that South Africa was debating wind and solar power. They had a very powerful ally in President Zuma in the years from 2009 to 2018, and in many parts of the African National Congress, which is the dominant party. So these are all very powerful actors in South Africa, all of whom had really quite strong vested interests in the continuation of a coal-based electricity sector. And because of some state capture or corruption dynamics under President Zuma, if they were going to have some kind of energy transition, they preferred nuclear power, where it was easier for them to arrange private benefits for President Zuma and his small inner circle from doing nuclear power. And then you had occasional power being exercised by this coalition that was in favor of wind and solar power. Definitely included the wind and solar industries themselves. It included labor for a time. It had environmental and social activists and the agencies connected to them, and then quite strong international pressures, especially from the climate negotiations for South Africa, and trade increasingly for South Africa to make those transitions. But the two actors that I've put in brackets here to some extent, changed positions during the years that I was doing the research for the book, with industrial allies going from being very skeptical of wind and solar power to being quite a bit more supportive as prices came down. They're very responsive to prices, whereas labor became increasingly skeptical of what it could gain from wind and solar power, and increasingly has moved into the opposition coalition. And of course, the ANC and ESCOM are some of their historic allies politically. Then you have really quite a different process going on in Brazil, because I think anybody who's been following Brazil knows that Brazil has had some very bitter debates on climate change in recent years. But what you might not be aware of is that even as the debate goes on, it is almost entirely about deforestation and agriculture and land. And in a survey done with the Bolsonaro government and other, or with Bolsonaro and other presidential candidates for the 2018 election, the only environmental measure that Bolsonaro favored was wind and solar power. And in that, he fit into this tradition then, that even as Brazil moved from center right to center left to center right, and some very contentious and difficult national political settings, there was a continuing consensus on wind and solar power. And it meant then that from the very beginning, the Brazilian debates on wind and solar power were left much more to bureaucrats. And my argument here is that a lot of that comes from this initial climate change political economy, rather than being that because the climate change political economy didn't particularly focus on energy in the Brazilian context, it left the wind and solar much freer to develop. Now, this is the half-hour version of this talk, and in the longer versions, I go through each of the political economies one by one. But for this shorter version of the talk, I now go through sort of 3 stories of what happens and why they happen. So there's a success story in here, which is the success story of Brazilian wind power. And these are the planning documents for Brazil from the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, the Energy Research Center out of the Ministry of Energy. And every year it does planning for the electricity sector, how much electricity of what kind will be procured. And as you can see here, it's been quite a steady upwards movement, with every year starting with the current production and steadily and increasingly quickly moving up and expecting that there will be more wind power procured in the next year. So what accounts for this success story of Brazilian wind power? Well, a lot of it has to do with things that I talk about in the industrial policy chapter. Because Brazil has auctions that it uses to procure electricity, and the cheapest bidder wins. And one of the best ways to be a cheap bidder in the Brazilian context is to get your financing from the Brazilian National Development Bank, BNDES. Well, as it happens, in order to get BNDES finance, companies needed to have, it began lower, but then was steadily moved up to BNDES's historical requirement of 60% local content. And that was achievable in wind power after demand increased. And so if you wanted to win an auction, you needed BNDES finance. To get BNDES finance, you needed to have components and labor drawn from Brazilian industrial sources. And so what that did was it provided a big impetus to having a Brazilian wind industry. And that came during the PT governments, the Workers' Party governments, that had additional expansive industrial policies. And so in the wind power sector in Brazil, you have what the literature calls a positive green spiral, where you start with some initial small steps, you develop a bit of industry, that then lobbies and works with government to procure more wind power. That makes a bigger industry that then lobbies to procure yet more. And so this collaborative working between the Brazilian government and the wind power industry is this positive green spiral that led to really quite good industrial policy outcomes of about 100,000 jobs in the wind power sector, and a quarter of them being manufacturing. And those are low numbers because the industry went on developing for a couple of years after that. But it is an industrial policy success story, really, in the wind power sector. It's more complicated than that. And if somebody's listening and knows some of the complications, feel free to ask me about it in the questions, because I know it's more complicated than that. But the basic story is this story of the positive green spiral. It's noteworthy that 25% of the host communities in Brazil mobilized against having wind farms in their communities. So there was, in fact, a strong component of Brazilian communities that were against having wind power come into their communities. That was largely for socioeconomic reasons. Many of these communities were up in the Northeast, in the former slave regions, and where there were populations that had limited land tenure rights. And so as wind and solar firms, wind power firms in particular, came in, communities lost access to land and access to beaches and the like. And so there was a lot of mobilization, but it didn't stop this larger process of expansion. It tended to move wind power from one part of Brazil to other parts of Brazil, moved it off of coastal Brazil to other locations. Then the delay story. It's not really a failure story, Brazilian solar power, it's more delay. And a lot of what makes it take so much longer for solar power to take off in Brazil is really cost. That's that for a long time, global solar power costs were just so much higher. And because of that, Brazilian planners were unable to procure much in the way of solar power because of those higher costs. But the other component of it, again, was an industrial policy story, which was that it's much more difficult because of the nature of the industry for Brazil to achieve 60% local content in solar power. So there was much less finance from BNDES. There was much less of that green spiral where you had industry and government working together. And the BNDES finance in solar power was not that much cheaper than the alternatives. And so the sort of finance, government, industry dynamic that you had going on in wind power really did not take place in solar power. And then because it was starting later, and you see here that it really only starts to take off in 2016, well, that's right after the controversial removal of Dilma Rousseff from the presidency, and you have the turn to the center right, and now increasingly the far right. And so there's less industrial policy and less supports. And so you find a very different picture in terms of industrial policy outcomes, where you have only about 10,000 solar jobs estimated, and most of those are the temporary installation jobs until they're actually put up. And there's not the benefit that might come from the consumption story, because the Brazilian Luz para Todos, light for all policy, actually worked primarily with grid scale power, and only 3,500 units were built in the Amazon, in particular for remote power. So there's not much of a story of providing electricity to consumers who did not have it before in the Brazilian case. And then the South African story. But you see again in the planning, you see that once solar power does take off, it has a relatively smooth dynamic. And I point that out in part to contrast it to the planning process in South Africa. So South Africa did a series of plans, national plans, of how much electricity that it was going to generate and build from different kinds of sources. But as you can see here, these plans, which were produced every couple of years, were completely different from each other in terms of thinking about what was South Africa going to produce. Some years, lots of solar power, some years, lots of wind power, some years, lots of nuclear, some years, none. But it was a country, in my view, this chart all by itself shows us the stalemate in South Africa and the lack of consensus in that country about whether or not wind and solar power should be built. Part of it is because there's that very strong status quo coalition, which is arguing and working against the transition in all of the chapters. But but there are details to that story. One of them is that the industrial policy story is very different for South Africa. Now, South Africa, actually, it has a similar auction system where companies bid to build electricity for the grid, but its auction system is not based only on price. 30% of the bid that a company makes is also what percentage of local content will we have in manufacturing, how many jobs are going to be produced, not just in general, but for Black South African populations near the installation. So it really tried to build in some of the broader economic outcomes. But very little of those promises in the bid have actually been achieved in practice. And a lot of that is just because there's not much sustained demand and from the procurement process. Eskom, the electrical parastatal, openly resisted signing contracts with wind and solar manufacturers from 2016 to 2018, and many manufacturers at that point simply left the country rather than remaining to be part of a system that did not look that it was like it was going to be doing much. And the status quo coalition, very importantly, eventually gained labor support because labor came to believe that it was more important to protect existing jobs in the coal industry, possibly to get new jobs in the nuclear industry, and moved away from working on an assumption that there could be 1 million climate jobs as they were once promised and mobilizing for. And the consumption story is a very interesting consumption. It's a very interesting story in that while solar power is often praised in developing countries for the way that it can bring electricity to new consumers who haven't had access to it before, in practice, there's a different dynamic going on in the South African case, which is that many of the consumers that have opted for solar power are actually the wealthy urban consumers who already had electricity and who are now providing for themselves in the electricity sector in much of the way that they provide for themselves private security, private education. They're opting out of the system of public provision, while poor households in South Africa reject the possibility of off-grid provision on the grounds that it really is not adequate for their consumption needs. So it's a rather different story. And I haven't put it on the slide here, but it's very much also a racial story, very explicitly in South Africa, because the apartheid government that left office in 1994 had a deliberate policy of not building electricity service for Black South Africans. And so the consumers who are without electricity still, and that's about 20% of the South African population, are Black South Africans. So there's very much a racial determination of who falls into which of these kinds of categories. But the overall story then is one where these coalitions have essentially fought themselves to a standstill rather than being able to make some kind of clear choice. And I suggest that maybe the South African pattern is a pattern that might be common where you have fossil fuel players playing a very large role in being present. Because what we found in South Africa was that you had pretty much the same coalitions, pro-status quo, pro-change, struggling over climate change, but then they also struggled over industrial policy. They also had arguments about what cost what. And in all of these, the parastatal Eskom was really at the center of them. And part of labor's argument too was that jobs in the electricity sector should be with a state-owned producer of electricity. And the fact that South Africa had almost all of its wind and solar power produced by private industry actors, where the coal and nuclear is produced by Eskom, has brought that debate over public versus private control into the center of the debate over wind and solar power. And as you can tell then, there's a highly politicized mode of transition with lots of contention, with very clear links to political actors like the ANC and the president, and wider debates about things like public versus private economies and the like. So it's headline news almost every day what's happening in the electricity sector in South Africa. And along with that then is a very contentious just transition debate about, well, if we do make the transition, what happens to coal communities, almost entirely Black South Africans again, what happens to coal-linked labor, again, Black South African and underserved households again. So there's a strong set of justice concerns about making the transition and this pretty significant stalemate that happens with wind and solar power as it gets caught in all of these debates. And then the national energy transition in Brazil, I suggest, might be an outcome where fossil fuel players are more absent. And it's really striking in the Brazilian case that the climate political economy is quite separate from the industrial policy one, which is quite separate from consumption, which is quite separate from location. So they're largely self-contained political economies. There isn't an ESCOM-like actor to organize them and overlap between the different political economies. And you end up then, in the Brazilian case, with a very bureaucratic mode of transition, where the important decisions end up being made by the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, by the planning agency in energy, by the Brazilian National Development Bank, by actors at quite low levels in some cases in the Ministry of Energy, who are just following their conventional standard operating procedures, cost benefit calculations, but it's really quite a technical debate in the Brazilian context. And as a result, the just transition debate about what might we do with people who are harmed by this is really quite muted when it comes to wind and solar power, although there's much more of it around hydropower, petroleum, and then some discussion of the communities that host wind power plants in the way that they are these communities that have been historically dispossessed through slavery and ensuing land rights. The lack of land rights claims being recognized. But then you get this difference then that as I was explaining has much more to do with sort of industrial policy and cost calculations than any more political debate. And this is then just the final slide. I'm not even sure where I am in terms of time. My clock always disappears when I start to share my screen, so then I never know. But the final slide just suggests that maybe what we need to expect is that national energy transitions are likely to be quite different from each other, and that at least one of the lines of differentiation is whether or not there is a fossil fuel electricity model, and if there are defenders of the fossil fuel electricity, then I think you probably do get this politicized mode of transition. And without a fossil fuel electricity-based sector, and as in the Brazilian case, you have a much more bureaucratic mode of transition. But the final point that I would just make, and I think even though I'm talking about sort of varieties of national energy transitions, is that I was also very struck in this book by how different the energy transitions were and how much they reflected existing institutions, existing groups of actors, existing power dynamics. And so I think we should expect that national energy transitions will also look different from each other because of the influence of other national political economies and not just the energy sector on its own. So as I say, I'm not sure where I am in time, but I will stop share and hope to have some questions now from you.
Sorry, just had to unmute myself. So questions have already started to come in. Again, if you do have a question that you'd like to ask of our guests, please do write it into the Q&A section and not the conversation section. We'll start with, say, 2 questions, Kathy, and then go from there. The first one is from Luma Ramos, who's a postdoc with the GDP Center. And Luma asks, how do initial technological costs influence or restrain energy transition? And then the second is from Becky Ray, a senior academic researcher at the GDP Center, who says, thank you for this fascinating exploration. Brazil's high local content requirements seem to be key. Do you think that that's replicable elsewhere, or only possible given Brazil's unique approach to bilateral investment treaties and long history of industrial policy? Why don't we start with those two?
Okay. And I'll say that part of my answer starts by saying that one of my concerns in the book and my choice of Brazil and South Africa as cases is that most of what we know about energy transitions is based on the European countries and other early movers in this sector. So Luma's question about initial technological costs, that initial group of countries that developed wind and solar power were not so preoccupied with cost. And in fact, in many ways, I think we owe some of this industry to the fact that Germans and Spaniards and Dutch consumers were willing to pay well more than they would have needed to for electricity during the early years of development of these industries. But Brazil and South Africa then come in at a very different point in the industry's development. They come in and they're starting to look at wind and solar power in the first decade of the 2000s when prices are still high, and solar prices in particular still very high. And they're middle income countries, lower middle income countries. So there are countries where price concerns really are quite important because consumers cannot overpay for electricity. And so I think the initial technological costs were in fact hugely important for explaining why Brazil started with wind power before it started with solar power. But the other thing that's of course true is that initial technological costs have been dropping dramatically since around 2010, and that by the time you reach 2014 and onwards, the cost of wind power first, but also solar power is dropping dramatically. And in fact, what you find is that at this point in time, wind power is one of the cheapest forms of electricity regularly in Brazil, and certainly to build. And so while I think that the initial technological costs were quite important, they are less important than they were. They're still important though, because the way wind and solar power work, almost all of the cost of having wind and solar power is at the point of installation. Then you don't pay for wind and you don't pay for solar power, whereas a coal power plant is much cheaper to build, but then you go on paying year after year for your coal or your petroleum or whatever it is that your fossil fuel is. And so what that means is it's made finance be a very large part of the calculation. There have to be new sources of finance. And my Brazilian and South African interviewees told me this regularly. What's the biggest constraint on these industries is about finding new sources of finance that will give that kind of upfront finance to countries and households and people who otherwise could not afford it. And then the second question from Rebecca Ray comes in, and I think it's actually related to this, because how is it that you justify paying higher prices as you are? And in fact, the economists inside the Ministry of Energy, when Brazil was first talking about wind power, actually made the deliberate calculation that the only way that Brazil could justify paying the higher costs of wind power were if they got a new industry out of it. So that if they could develop a new industrial sector, that would make doing wind power worth doing. And so but the Ministry of Energy has never had a local content policy beyond an initial very small procurement through a feed-in tariff. But almost all of Brazil's electricity has been simply procured through these auctions that are based on price and price only. So it really has required the Brazilian National Development Bank. So this gets to your question about whether it's about Brazil's unique approach to investment and industrial policy. I think without the Brazilian National Development Bank, and you saw this absence in South Africa, it's not complete absence, but not such a big actor with as much money as it had in these stages, that really was instrumental for helping wind power take off. So I think it was really quite key. I don't know that it's replicable. These are some of the biggest, most industrialized countries of their regions and of the developing world. They had a hard time outside of Brazilian wind power actually being able to develop anything like a very significant domestic production. And if Brazil and South Africa can't do it, then probably Bolivia and Gabon have even less chance. And I do think that there are a number of countries that think that local content requirements and the ability to build a new industry are going to be things that make wind and solar power work for them. And I'm just not sure that it's true for as many countries as think it will be.
Okay, let's do another round here. Rishikesh Bandari, Assistant Director of the Global Economic Governance Initiative. And to your point about names, I know I always mispronounce Rishi's name. I'm sorry, Rishi. How do you see the 8.5 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa changing the political economy on the ground? That's the next question, and then we'll do one more before a final round. This question's from Flavio Montiel. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Considering that the PT government built the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam, which has had socio-environmental impacts, what are your expectations for the energy sector in the coming years should the PT win the elections this year? And then considering that Benedessa has reduced its investments in infrastructure projects, what is the role of Chinese financial institutions in expanding their presence in Brazil's infrastructure sector, especially in the country's energy matrix? I'll leave you with those two for now.
Right. Well, I'll answer Rishi's question then. And of course, that's our Minister of Finance here in the UK, Rishi Sunak. So that's a name that we know well. I don't know that it stands, I don't know if it's short for Rishikesh or not, but this particular Just Transition partnership comes out after the research for my book was completed. So I'm going to speak to the larger question about just energy transition more generally and say that I think that in the South African context, there will be no energy transition if it cannot be made a just transition. And that this is an initiative that's happening now. I've now, over the period of time that I was doing the research for my book, saw a couple of other instances of trying to develop these transitions. I don't know, none of them have yet been fully successful. And I think they're going to need to go on being developed over some period of time. But I think that the impetus is exactly right. And it has to do with the very last point that I made on the South Africa slide. When you go to look at the energy sector, and especially the electricity sector in South Africa, it is so imbued with South Africa's racial history, the systematic exclusion of Black South Africans from the electricity sector, that without addressing the way that those racial and social inequalities are really built into the South African political economy more generally, and the electricity infrastructure in particular, you will not be able to get a transition. And unfortunately, at the moment, it's a difficult transition because there's so little money in the South African context. So 8.5 billion is quite important. 8.5 billion, I don't think, is likely to be enough money to address all of the different components of this. But I think this is a positive next step in what I see as what is now at least an 8-year conversation about how South Africa can address those issues. And I think that that it's an initiative that there must be some resolution to these issues, or there will not be a transition. So again, you may well know more about this very specific initiative than I do. I've been a head of department in a pandemic for the last 2 years, so I've been solving local problems. But I think that the issue generally very much needs to be addressed. Then the issue that Flavio raises, and it's really, raising the fact that if wind and solar power becomes a larger part of the electricity matrix, the question is, what is it displacing, or what other kinds of alternatives might be part of the broader electricity planning? And it's kind of interesting to me that back in 2016, so that's a long time ago in Brazil, but back in 2016, the Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, the planning agency in Brazil, its president actually said, look, we can't build any more hydropower in Brazil. And he said they couldn't because of the socio-environmental impacts, because of the ways that local communities were so mobilized against those socio-environmental impacts that building new hydro dams, which because of Brazil's hydro sources would have to be built in the Amazon, that it looked to him like it was not tenable to build any more large hydroelectric dams, and certainly not to build them in the Amazon, and there weren't water resources to do it elsewhere. So, but that was in 2016. And in the years since, the Energy Planning Agency has backed off of that conclusion. And so I think that this election that's going to be happening in the next year, and of course, the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam was built under the Lula government. So I think we can't assume, or not built under the Lula government, but the final permitting of it and it going forward happened under the Lula government. I think we can't assume that simply having Lula return in the next election is going to resolve this question about the major socio-environmental and personal impacts of large hydropower. So I think that in some ways I'm waiting to see the next election, and I'm also waiting to see how the next government, whoever it is, creates this balance between those. On the financing question, BNDES has reduced its investments in infrastructure projects, but it's interesting to know that actually the partial exception to that is in wind power. And BNDES has been quite interesting in recent years in its approach. One of the things that it's done is actually issued a number of green bonds to international investors that are then available for financing wind power plants inside. So it's partly a matter of sort of segmenting the international investor market and figuring out that there are some investors that particularly want to invest in green projects, and BNDES has used those as a source of additional finance now that its government allocations have gone back down. And so, and it also has received some fairly large sums of money from some of the European, the German, and also the Japanese development banks, and I think the French development bank also, to the bank specifically for wind power. And so in many ways, the finance available through BNDES for wind power continues to be higher than it is in almost all sectors. It has not fallen as much there as it has elsewhere. But I think that the question here about what's the role of Chinese financial institutions, I mean, I think that because of BNDES's declining role generally in infrastructure, we are going to be seeing a diversification of financial sources, and none of the financial sources, except for BNDES, have the local content policy. So some of that kind of reinforcing element of finance will be, is being pulled away from the Brazilian infrastructure sector. And some of the industry actors that I was talking to were then really trying hard to get the Ministry of Energy to add its own local content requirement, but it has steadfastly refused to do that. And I don't know that it will be deciding to do that in the future. So that the diversification of the sources of finance have that kind of implication for the declining role of, that further means a declining role for industrial policy in the development of wind power in particular.
Thank you, Kathy. And we'll just take the two last questions here from Jeanette from the Transparency and Accountability Initiative in Washington, D.C. Do you know of a case in which there was a high local content such as Brazil, but success was limited? And Soo Young Oh, an assistant researcher at the Climate Policy Lab at Tufts University. How did Petrobras respond to the wind deployment in Brazil? And would it be a future constraint to the renewables deployment in Brazil? We'll leave those as the last two questions for you, Kathy.
Okay. Well, Jeanette, I have a kind of funny answer to you, which is that, yes, I know a case in which there was a high local content such as Brazil, but success was limited. And my case is Brazil, because there were points at which, so I gave you the success story of Brazilian wind power, and the local content policy. But I don't know if you remember that in the chart of wind power, it's flat for a very long time before it starts to go up. And the initial feed-in tariff for wind power in Brazil did have a local content policy. So it was put in by the center-right Cardoso administration, kept and raised a bit from 50 to 60% by the Lula administration. And during that first decade, one of the reasons that it took so long for wind power to start working at all was because they were starting from scratch. And there really wasn't the kind of domestic production that was being required to be part of that initial procurement of wind power. And so I think you could, and in my book, I say this, I think you can say that wind power in Brazil was actually delayed by the requirement of local content. But then once you reached a kind of critical mass of demand, then you had the wind power sector take off. And I stress in the book that we focus too much with industrial policy on the production side, but in both the Brazilian and South African cases, it became very clear that one of the things that really mattered was consumption. That once there was enough demand for wind power from government procurement in the Brazilian case, then it was worth the while of manufacturers to come, local content policy or not, to Brazil to help to meet that demand. But as long as demand was low, it wasn't worth coming and starting the industry. And in the South African case, a big part of the story of why wind power and solar power really didn't take off, especially in the production side, was because there was never sufficient procurement-based demand for those industries to bother coming. So the demand side is just as important as the industry support side. And then just this final thing about Petrobras. Petrobras is a very smooth actor on environmental issues. It would not be like Petrobras to kind of openly confront a climate policy. But the interesting thing is that in the short term, Petrobras and gas producers generally in Brazil have actually benefited, because one of the things that has grown along with wind power in particular is the use of natural gas-fired power plants. Petrobras produces that to be the stabilizer for demand, because wind doesn't blow continuously. And so Brazil has used the rise of wind and solar power actually to justify also expanding natural gas-based electricity plants. So at the moment, Petrobras is seeing an expansion of the electricity sector for natural gas, and not seeing that it is being limited by this development.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy. I really appreciate your talk and sharing your thoughts with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined this discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning, this talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we will share the link in the chat now. To receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe. To receive updates from our Global Economic Governance Initiative, we will also put a link in the chat to subscribe. And thank you all, and see you next time. And thanks to Kathy.
Thank you all.